When I first announced to you that I was going to give you readings from the modernism unit that we would normally cover in fourth quarter, I did promise that it includes a story that is certainly the most disturbing and grotesque story that we have in our literature book. And here it is, A Rose for Emily by William Faulkner. I'm going to give a quick introduction, and then if you want to go ahead and read the story for yourself, you can jump back into the video when I give my thoughts at the end. And I really hope that you do that because um, I think, yeah, well, as you'll see in the story, there is a very disturbing ending to the story, but it isn't just for shock value. I think there is some real thought and heart to this story that I think you would miss if the only thing you took away from it is this one final grotesque image that we're left with at the end. But I'll show the rest of my thoughts on that for the end of the video. To introduce it, though, I do just want to quickly explain what Southern Gothic is, because that's the genre that this story is written in. First, we need to go back to what Gothic fiction is. So this is, fiction in the 1800s in Europe that and focused on dark, creepy settings, often included themes of death and decay. There's a word macabre that we associate with that idea that describe these kinds of stories. And some examples of this, famously Dracula and Frankenstein. Early books in the genre that we now would call horror, but at the time was given the label Gothic fiction. So that was something that existed in Europe in the 1800s. Now, what happened in the U.S. In American literature in the 20th century is that some writers started to see some connections between some of these Gothic ideas and what they saw in the American South. All right, so really quickly, in the American South, post Civil War, you had a lot of economic hardships, with the economic toll that the Civil War itself took on the South. Plus, you have these newly liberated slaves. It led to that collapse of the plantation system that was the foundation of the economy of the South. And I really like this picture here I'm showing you. This is an old plantation house, and if you look closely, you can see that it has clearly fallen into ruin. And that's where you get, I mentioned that the Gothic literature emphasized ideas of death and decay. So American writers were looking at the South and looking at what was happening post Civil War during that Reconstruction era, and what they saw was decay. And so a lot of writers started to experiment with this new genre that we call Southern Gothic. So it borrows from those elements of the Gothic tradition, but now in a modern American setting. We again see those themes of death and decay, but here in the American South, post Civil War, there is a very strong emphasis on elements of the grotesque, of things that are gross, that are disgusting, things that repulse us. And I think it's important to note that all of this, the idea of Southern Gothic really is a reflection of the socioeconomic state of the American South. And I think it's important to know all of this going into A Rose for Emily because all of these things are reflected in the story. All right, so now I am going to read the story itself. When Miss Emily Grierson died, our whole town went to her funeral. The men through a sort of respectful affection for a fallen monument, the women mostly out of curiosity to see the inside of her house, which no one, save an old manservant, a combined gardener and cook, had seen in at least 10 years. It was a big, squarish frame house that had once been white, decorated with cupolas and spires and scrolled balconies in the heavily lightsome style of the 70s, set on what had once been our most select street. But garages and cotton gins had encroached and obliterated even the august names of that neighborhood. Only Miss Emily's house was left, lifting its stubborn and coquettish decay above the cotton wagons and the gasoline pumps, an eyesore, among eyesores, and now Miss Emily had gone to join the representatives of those august names where they lay in the cedar-bemused cemetery among the ranked and anonymous graves of Union and Confederate soldiers who fell at the Battle of Jefferson. All right, a couple of very important things I want to point out right now. First of all, we're starting the story with the death of Emily, so that this is starting at the end. And then after this section, we're going to go back and we're going to see earlier events. Just keep that in mind. And this description of her house, I think, is hugely important for the story. We have in here outright mention of that theme of decay that I was talking about, but also I think it's important to note that this house of hers, this was a house that existed before the Civil War. This house is part of the Old South. And all around it have popped up these things of the modern world, gasoline pumps, garages. Those are all things that came about with the advent of the automobile in the 20th century. So the image we have here is of this old pre-Civil War house that has fallen into decay, and all around it have popped up these new modern things. And her house is out of place in that modern world. This is a major theme of this story. So just keep that in mind. Alive, Miss Emily had been a tradition, a duty, and a care, a sort of hereditary obligation about the town, dating from that day in 1894 when Colonel Sartoris, the mayor, he who fathered the edict that no Negro woman should appear in the streets without an apron, remitted her taxes, a dispensation dating from the death of her father on into perpetuity. Not that Miss Emily would have accepted charity. Colonel Sartoris invented an involved tale to the effect that Miss Emily's father had loaned money to the town, which the town, as a matter of business, preferred this way of repaying. Only a man of Colonel Sartoris's generation and thought could have invented it, and only a woman could have believed it. When the next generation, with its more modern ideas, became mayors and aldermen, this arrangement created some little dissatisfaction. On the first of the year, they mailed her a tax notice. February came and there was no reply. They wrote her a formal letter asking her to call at the sheriff's office at her convenience. A week later, the mayor wrote her himself, offering to call or to send his car for her, and received in reply a note on paper of an archaic shape in a thin, flowing calligraphy and faded ink, to the effect that she no longer went out at all. The tax notice was also enclosed without comment. They called a special meeting of the Board of Aldermen. A deputation waited upon her, knocked at the door, through which no visitor had passed since she ceased giving China painting lessons 8 or 10 years earlier. They were admitted by the old Negro into a dim hall from which a stairway mounted into still more shadow. It smelled of dust and disuse, that close, dank smell. The Negro led them into the parlor. It was furnished in heavy, leather-covered furniture. When the Negro opened the blinds of one window, they could see that the leather was cracked, and when they sat down, a faint dust rose sluggishly about their thighs, spinning with slow motes in the single sun ray. On a tarnished gilt easel before the fireplace stood a crayon portrait of Miss Emily's father. They rose when she entered. A small, fat woman in black, with a thin gold chain descending to her waist and vanishing into her belt, leaning on an ebony cane with a tarnished gold head. Her skeleton was small and spare. Perhaps that was why what would have been merely plumpness in another was obesity in her. She looked bloated, like a body long submerged in motionless water, and of that pallid hue. Her eyes, lost in the fatty ridges of her face, looked like two small pieces of coal pressed into a lump of dough as they moved from one face to another while the visitors stated their errand. I think this is a great example of that idea of the grotesque that I was talking about earlier. In the description of her says she looks like a drowned corpse. Her eyes look like coal pressed into a lump of dough. Very gross imagery of her appearance. She did not ask them to sit. She just stood in the door and listened quietly until the spokesman came to a stumbling halt. Then they could hear the invisible watch ticking at the end of the gold chain. Her voice was dry and cold. "I have no taxes in Jefferson. Colonel Sartoris explained it to me. Perhaps one of you can gain access to the city records and satisfy yourselves." But we have. We are the city authorities, Miss Emily. Didn't you get a notice from the sheriff signed by him? I received a paper, yes, Miss Emily said. Perhaps he considers himself the sheriff. I have no taxes in Jefferson. But there's nothing on the books to show that, you see. We must go by the... See, Colonel Sartoris, I have no taxes in Jefferson. But Miss Emily, see Colonel Sartoris. Colonel Sartoris had been dead almost 10 years. I have no taxes in Jefferson. Toby, the Negro appeared. Show these gentlemen out. All right, that's the end of the first section. So I'm just going to remind you again, things are told out of order in this story, and so I think it's important that you try to keep straight in your mind the actual order that things occurred. So first, we started out when she dies, and then it moved earlier in time, just a little bit, when she was an old woman, and these modern men came around collecting taxes, not understanding the old ways. Let's go on. So she vanquished them, horse and foot, just as she had vanquished their fathers 30 years before about the smell. So now we're moving quite a bit earlier in time. 30 years earlier, there was some kind of smell, and that was 2 years after her father's death, and a short time after her sweetheart, the one we believed would marry her, had deserted her. After her father's death, she went out very little. After her sweetheart went away, people hardly saw her at all. A few of the ladies had the temerity to call, but were not received, and the only sign of life about the place was the Negro man, a young man then, going in and out with a market basket. Just as if any man could keep a kitchen properly, the ladies said, so they were not surprised when the smell developed. It was another link between the gross, teeming world and the high and mighty Griersons. A neighbor, a woman, complained to the mayor, Judge Stevens, 80 years old. But what will you have me to do about it, madam? He said. I sent her word to stop it, the woman said. Isn't there a law? I'm sure that won't be necessary, Judge Stevens said. It's probably just a snake or a rat that nigger of hers killed in the yard. I'll speak to him about it. The next day he received 2 more complaints, one from a man who came in diffident deprecation. We really must do something about it, Judge. I'd be the last one in the world to bother Miss Emily. We've got to do something. That night the Board of Aldermen met, 3 graybeards and 1 younger man, a member of the rising generation. It's simple enough, he said. Send her word to have her place cleaned up. Give her a certain time to do it, and if she don't... Damn it, sir, Judge Stevens said. Will you accuse a lady to her face of smelling bad? So the next night, after midnight, 4 men crossed Miss Emily's lawn and slunk about the house like burglars, sniffing along the base of the brickwork and at the cellar openings, while one of them performed a regular sewing motion with his hand out of a sack slung from his shoulder. They broke open the cellar door and sprinkled lime there and in all the outbuildings. As they recrossed the lawn, a window that had been dark was lighted, and Miss Emily sat in it, the light behind her and her upright torso motionless as that of an idol. They crept quietly across the lawn and into the shadow of the locusts that lined the street. After a week or 2, the smell went away. That was when people had begun to feel really sorry for her. People in our town, remembering how old Lady Wyatt, her great aunt, had gone completely crazy at last, believed that the Griersons held themselves a little too high for what they really were. None of the young men were quite good enough for Miss Emily and such. We had long thought of them as a tableau. Miss Emily, a slender figure in white in the background, her father, a spraddled silhouette in the foreground, his back to her and clutching a horsewhip, the 2 of them framed by the back-flung front door. So when she got to be 30 and was still single, we were not pleased exactly, but vindicated. Even with insanity in the family, she wouldn't have turned down all of her chances if they had really materialized. When her father died, it got about that the house was all that was left to her, and in a way, people were glad. At last they could pity Miss Emily, being left alone and a pauper. She had become humanized. Now she too would know the thrill and the old despair of a penny more or less. The day after his death, all the ladies prepared to call at the house and offer condolence and aid, as is our custom. Miss Emily met them at the door, dressed as usual, and with no trace of grief on her face. She told them that her father was not dead. She did that for 3 days, with the ministers calling on her and the doctors, trying to persuade her to let them dispose of the body. Just as they were about to resort to law and force, she broke down, and they buried her father quickly. We did not say she was crazy then. We believed she had to do that. We remembered all the young men her father had driven away, and we knew that with nothing left, she would have to cling to that which had robbed her, as people will. All right, that's the second section. So, two really important things were discussed in this section. One, the smell outside of her house that the neighbors were complaining about, and them sneaking out and sprinkling quicklime around her house to try to get rid of the smell. And the other is that when her father died, she had this really weird thing where she told people he wasn't dead and held onto his body in the house for 3 days until they finally went in there and took him and buried him. All right, now a lot of people, first time read this story, see these two events and think that the smell around her house was caused by the body of her father, but it wasn't. Because if you look back, if you look carefully, there are some little things dropped in the story that talk about the timing of it. Um, Basically, what we know is that the smell around her house didn't appear until 2 years after her father died. And her father was buried after 3 days. So the smell cannot be from her father. We don't know yet what that smell is from, but we'll find out. All right, section 3. She was sick for a long time. When we saw her again, her hair was cut short, making her look like a girl with a vague resemblance to those angels in colored church windows, sort of tragic and serene. The town had just let the contracts for paving the sidewalks, and in the summer after her father's death, they began the work. The construction company came with riggers and mules and machinery, and a foreman named Homer Barron, a Yankee, a big, dark, ready man with a big voice and eyes lighter than his face. The little boys would follow in groups to hear him cuss the riggers, and the riggers singing in time to the rise and fall of picks. Pretty soon he knew everybody in town. Whenever you heard a lot of laughing anywhere about the square, Homer Barron would be in the center of the group. Presently we began to see him and Miss Emily on Sunday afternoons driving in the yellow-wheeled buggy and the matched team of bays from the livery stable. At first we were glad that Miss Emily would have an interest, because the ladies all said, of course, a Grierson would not think seriously of a northerner, a day laborer. There were still others, older people, who said that even grief could not cause a real lady to forget noblesse oblige without calling it noblesse oblige. They just said, poor Emily. Her kinsfolk should come to her. She had some kin in Alabama, but years ago her father had fallen out with them over the estate of old Lady Wyatt, the crazy woman, and there was no communication between the two families. They had not even been represented at the funeral. And as soon as the old people said, poor Emily, the whispering began. Do you suppose it's really so? They said to one another. Of course it is. What else could this behind their hands? Rustling of cranes, silk, and satin behind jalousies closed upon the sun of Sunday afternoon as the thin, swift clop, clop, clop of the matched team passed. Poor Emily. She carried her head high enough, even when we believed that she was fallen. It was as if she demanded more than ever the recognition of her dignity as the last Grierson, as if it had wanted that touch of earthiness to reaffirm her imperviousness. Like when she bought the rat poison, the arsenic. That was over a year after they had begun to say poor Emily, and while the two female cousins were visiting her. I want some poison, she said to the druggist. She was over 30 then, still a slight woman, though thinner than usual, with cold, haughty black eyes and a face the flesh of which was strained across the temples and about the eye sockets as you imagine a lighthouse keeper's face ought to look. I want some poison, she said. Yes, Miss Emily. What kind? For rats and such? I want the best you have. I don't care what kind. The druggist named several. They'll kill anything up to an elephant, but what you want is arsenic, Miss Emily said. Is that a good one? Yes. Arsenic? Yes, ma'am, but what you want? I want arsenic. The druggist looked down at her. She looked back at him, erect, her face like a strained flag. Why, of course, the druggist said, if that's what you want, but the law requires you to tell what you are going to use it for. Miss Emily just stared at him, her head tilted back in order to look him eye for eye, until he looked away and went and got the arsenic and wrapped it up. The Negro delivery boy brought her the package. The druggist didn't come back. When she opened the package at home, there was written on the box, under the skull and bones, for rats. So the next day we all said she will kill herself. and we said it would be the best thing. When she had first begun to be seen with Homer Barron, we had said she'll marry him. Then we said she'll persuade him yet, because Homer himself had remarked he liked men, and it was known that he drank with the younger men in the Elks Club, that he was not a marrying man. Later, we said poor Emily behind the jalousies as they passed on Sunday afternoon in the glittering buggy, Miss Emily with her head high, and Homer Barron with his hat cocked and his cigar in his teeth, reins and whip, and a yellow glove. All right. There was something subtle here. You might have picked up on this about Homer Barron. Already, people disapprove of Emily being involved with Homer Barron because he is a northerner. He's kind of a lower class than she is, since he's a day laborer. But there's also this. We have this remark. And you notice that the narrative of the story is one of the people in town. And a lot of what he's telling comes from gossip. These people in the town love to gossip. And there's a remark here that Homer Barron liked men, and he drank with younger men in town, and it's mentioned just as kind of a side comment in this sentence saying that he was not a marrying man. So the implication here is, well, one of two things. Either Homer Barron is gay, or at least that the people in town think that he's gay. Either way, that's part of the reason why they say poor Emily. Whether it's true or not, they believe that Emily has taken up with a gay man, and they know, well, obviously he's not going to marry her. Then some of the ladies began to say that it was a disgrace to the town and a bad example to the young people. The men did not want to interfere, but at last the ladies forced the Baptist minister, Miss Emily's people were Episcopal, to call upon her. He would never indulge what happened during that interview, but he refused to go back again. The next Sunday, they again drove about the streets, and the following day, the minister's wife wrote to Miss Emily's relations in Alabama. So she had blood kin under her roof again, and we sat back to watch developments. At first, nothing happened. Then we were sure that they were to be married. We learned that Miss Emily had been to the jeweler's and ordered a man's toilet set in silver, with the letters HB on each piece. Remember this toilet set. 2 days later, we learned that she had bought a complete outfit of men's clothing, including a nightshirt, and we said, they are married. We were really glad. We were glad because the two female cousins were even more Grierson than Miss Emily had ever been. So we were not surprised when Homer Barron, the streets had been finished some time since, was gone. We were a little disappointed that there was not a public blowing off, but we believed that he had gone on to prepare for Miss Emily's coming, or to give her a chance to get rid of the cousins. By that time it was a cabal, and we were all Miss Emily's allies to help circumvent the cousins. Sure enough, after another week, they departed, and as we had expected all along, within 3 days, Homer Barron was back in town. A neighbor saw the Negro man admit him at the kitchen door at dusk one evening. And that was the last we saw of Homer Barron, and of Miss Emily for some time. The Negro man went in and out with the market basket, but the front door remained closed. Now and then we would see her at a window for a moment, as the men did that night when they sprinkled the lime. But for almost 6 months she did not appear on the streets. Then we knew that this was to be expected too, as if that quality of her father, which had thwarted her woman's life so many times, had been too virulent and too furious to die. All right. So, just to work out the timing here, you see here it's talking about Homer Barron is gone, and it's after that that they sprinkled the lime outside of her house because of that smell, remember? Just to help you with some of the timing here. When we next saw Miss Emily, she had grown fat and her hair was turning gray. Also, pay attention to how her hair is changing colors. During the next few years, it grew grayer and grayer until it attained an even pepper and salt iron gray when it ceased turning. Up to the death of her death at 74, it was still that vigorous iron gray, like the hair of an active man. From that time on, her front door remained closed, save for a period of 6 or 7 years when she was about 40, during which she gave lessons in china painting. She fitted up a studio in one of the downstairs rooms where the daughters and granddaughters of Colonel Sartorus's contemporaries were sent to her with the same regularity and in the same spirit that they were sent to church on Sundays with a 25-cent piece for the collection plate. Meanwhile, her taxes had been remitted. Then the newer generation became the backbone and the spirit of the town. Notice the theme again here of things changing, of the new modern generation coming up. So the new generation is now running things. And the painting pupils grew up and fell away and did not send their children to her with boxes of color and tedious brushes and pictures cut from the ladies' magazines. The front door closed upon the last winter remained closed for good. When the town got free postal delivery, Miss Emily alone refused to let them fasten the metal numbers above her door and attach a mailbox to it. She would not listen to them. Daily, monthly, yearly, we watched the Negro grow grayer and more stooped, going in and out with the market basket. Each December, we sent her a tax notice, which would be returned by the post office a week later, unclaimed. Now and then, we would see her in one of the downstairs windows. She had evidently shut up the top floor of the house, like the carven torso of an idol in a niche, looking or not looking at us. We could never tell which. Thus she passed from generation to generation, dear, inescapable, impervious, tranquil, and perverse. And so she died, fell ill in the house filled with dust and shadows, with only a doddering Negro man to wait on her. We did not even know she was sick. We had long since given up trying to get any information from the Negro. He talked to no one, probably not even to her, for his voice had grown harsh and rusty as if from disuse. She died in one of the downstairs rooms, in a heavy walnut bed with a curtain, her gray head propped on a pillow, yellow and moldy with age and lack of sunlight. The Negro met the first of the ladies at the front door and let them in, with their hushed sibilant voices and their quick, curious glances, and then he disappeared. He walked right through the house and out the back, was not seen again. The two female cousins came at once. They held the funeral on the second day, with the town coming to look at Miss Emily beneath a mass of bought flowers, with the crayon face of her father musing profoundly above the bier, and the ladies sibilant and macabre, and the very old men, some in their brushed Confederate uniforms, on the porch and the lawn, talking of Miss Emily as if she had been a contemporary of theirs, believing that they had danced with her and courted her, perhaps, confusing time with its mathematical progression, as the old do, to whom all the past is not a diminishing road, but instead a huge meadow which no winter ever quite touches, divided from them now by the narrow bottleneck of the most recent decade of years. Already we know that there was one room in that region above stairs which no one had seen in 40 years, and which would have to be forced. They waited until Miss Emily was decently in the ground before they opened it. The violence of breaking down the door seemed to fill this room with pervading dust. A thin, acrid pall, as of the tomb, seemed to lie everywhere upon this room, decked and furnished as for a bridal. All right, now, if you got lost in some of that description earlier, after Emily has died and buried, after her funeral, they decide to go up into this upstairs room that nobody has been into in years. And it's like a tomb. Upon the valance, curtains of faded rose color, upon the rose-shaded lights, upon the dressing table, upon the delicate array of crystal, and the man's toilet things, backed with tarnished silver. Remember, that's the gift she bought for Homer Barron. Silver so tarnished that the monogram was obscured. Among them lay a collar and tie, as if they had just been removed, which lifted, left upon the surface a pale crescent in the dust. Upon a chair hung the suit carefully folded, beneath it the two mute shoes and the discarded socks. The man himself lay in the bed. All right, here's where things get really grotesque. So in the bed is the body of Homer Barron, in case you haven't figured it out for yourself yet. For a long while we just stood there, looking down at the profound and fleshless grin. The body had apparently once lain in the attitude of an embrace, but now the long sleep that outlasts love, that conquers even the grimace of love, had cuckolded him. What was left of him, rotted beneath what was left of the nightshirt, had become inextricable from the bed in which he lay, and upon him and upon the pillow beside him lay that even coating of the patient and biding dust. Then we noticed that in the second pillow was the indentation of a head. One of us lifted something from it, and leaning forward, that faint and invisible dust, dry and acrid in the nostrils, we saw a long strand of iron gray hair. All right, so obviously, the thing that people remember about this story is that grotesque and disturbing image at the end of Homer Barron's desiccated remains melded with the bed's mattress, and the iron gray hair that is the sign that Emily lay in bed with the corpse, not just after he died, but even for years after. Because remember, the story told us it wasn't until years after he died that her hair turned iron gray. The use of iron gray is very significant in the story, when we're meant to know she lay in the bed next to his corpse for years. It's repulsive. But I also want you to know that, as shocking as that image is, it's not just in this story for pure shock value. I think William Faulkner is saying something very significant in this story about the culture of the American South. Throughout the story, there are indications that Emily cannot let go of the past. Her house is the only one in the neighborhood still standing from the old pre-Civil War days. Around her are gas stations and garages, signs of the modern world. When the post office puts numbers on everyone's houses, Emily refuses to let them put them on her house. When her father died, she refused to let him be buried. Emily's tragedy is that she cannot let go of the past. The world is changing around her, and she's still rooted to this version of the South that existed before the Civil War. And we see that in other characters in the story too. At her funeral, and mentioned that there were men who came there dressed in their brushed Confederate uniforms. All these old men are dusting off those Confederate uniforms to wear them to her funeral, and even talks about how they remember dancing with her, even though maybe they didn't actually. Maybe some of these things that they're remembering never actually happened. I think this is a really significant paragraph. I think this is saying something about how nostalgia and memory works, that we have a way of remembering the past as better than it actually was. So I think that's what William Faulkner is talking about here. I think Emily is a symbol of the American South itself and the way that the people of the South tend to cling to the past. Now, I think we can all agree that if we looked at the history of American culture and politics in the 20th century, what we see time and again is that as the rest of the country progresses into new modern realities and embraces social change, that without judgment, I think we can accurately say that southern states tend to be much more reluctant to accept those changes and maybe even want things to go back to the way that they used to be. Now, in A Rose for Emily, I don't necessarily think this is intended as an outright criticism. From his tone, the narrator of the story seems to feel sorry for Emily. And even the title of the story, I believe, is William Faulkner offering a rose of sympathy to this woman who came of age in a world that no longer exists. There's some tragedy in her. And I think that's the way Faulkner felt about the American South. I think he felt a lot of affection for the South, even as he recognized some of its flaws.